He was sent to a mountain ranch like unwanted luggage. No skills, no welcome, no second chances. The woman waiting there had prepared for a capable man, a strong partner, someone built for the brutal frontier winter. Instead, she got him. Thin, pale, completely useless. And yet, he refused to leave. What happened next on that frozen mountain would cost both of them everything. If you've ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love you, stay with me, because this story was made for you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Chapter 1, The End of the Road. The train arrived at Coldwater Station 40 minutes late, which felt appropriate. Nothing in Caleb Mercer's life had arrived on time. Not his father's approval, not his brother's respect, and certainly not whatever thin, miserable future was waiting for him at the end of this particular railroad line. He sat in the last car of the passenger train with one leather bag between his feet and a folded document in his coat pocket that he hadn't opened since his father's attorney had pressed it into his hands 3 weeks ago in Denver. He didn't need to open it. He had read the thing so many times the words had burned themselves into the backs of his eyelids. Partnership agreement, Thorn Ridge Ranch, Wyoming Territory. Signatory, Mercer family representative. That was the language his father's lawyer had used. Not Caleb, not even son, just representative, as if he were a piece of furniture being shipped to fill a room. The train lurched to a stop, and Caleb pressed his forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the world was white and gray and completely indifferent. Snow covered the platform in a thick, undisturbed sheet. The mountains behind the station rose so steeply they seemed to lean forward, threatening. A wind moved through the gap between two buildings and threw a sheet of powder snow sideways across the platform. And the two other passengers in his car, a heavy-set merchant and a woman traveling with an enormous birdcage, pulled their coats tighter without looking up. Caleb picked up his bag. He was 26 years old. He had grown up in a brownstone townhouse in Boston, studied accounting for 2 years at a college his father had paid for, and then stopped paying for and spent the last 4 years working in a counting house on the wrong side of a desk that was never going to be his. He had, in his entire life, ridden a horse maybe a dozen times, always on groomed trails, always with someone else holding the lead rope. He had never worked cattle, never split timber, never slept anywhere that wasn't within walking distance of a gas lamp and a hot meal. He pushed open the door of the train car and stepped out into Wyoming. The cold hit him like a physical object, not the dry, manageable cold of a Boston winter morning. This was something else entirely, something with weight and intent, something that pushed straight through his wool coat and pressed against his ribs like a hand. He gasped once, involuntarily, and his breath came out as a white cloud that the wind immediately shredded apart. The station platform was nearly empty. A station master stood under the overhang of the building, watching Caleb with the particular expression of a man who had seen too many city people step off trains and immediately regret it. A teenage boy was loading freight boxes onto a cart. There was a horse tied to the post at the far end of the platform, a dark brown animal that turned its enormous head toward Caleb and regarded him with what he could only describe as professional skepticism. Standing beside the horse, arms crossed, an expression set somewhere between boredom and mild contempt, was a woman. She was not what he had imagined. He hadn't imagined much. He'd had enough problems of his own without constructing elaborate fantasies about the stranger he was being shipped to. But whatever vague shape his mind had built, this wasn't it. She was tall, which surprised him first. Tall and straight-backed, wearing a heavy canvas duster coat over what appeared to be men's work clothes. Her dark hair pulled back so severely it looked almost painful. She might have been 30 or 35. It was hard to tell, because her face had the quality of someone who had spent years being looked at by wind rather than sheltered from it. Not old, just weathered in a way that Boston women weren't. She was looking at him the way he imagined a rancher looked at a horse they'd bought sight unseen from a catalog, with immediate, undisguised disappointment. He walked toward her. The snow on the platform was maybe 6 inches deep, and he was wearing dress shoes. By the time he covered the 30 feet between them, his feet were already soaked through. "Eliza Thorne?" he said. "That's right." She didn't offer her hand. Her eyes moved over him once, top to bottom, in the flat, assessing way of someone pricing livestock. "You're the Mercer?" "Caleb Mercer, yes." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something she had already suspected and hadn't wanted confirmed. "The agreement named Adrian Mercer. I know, there were—" He stopped, started again. "Circumstances changed. My brother wasn't able to—" "He didn't come." "No." "And they sent you." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't cruel exactly, but it landed the way a door being closed lands, with a finality that doesn't need to raise its voice. She looked at his bag. She looked at his shoes. She looked at his hands, pale, uncalloused, with the soft, unmarked skin of someone who had spent his life pushing paper, and something in her face went very still. "Do you have any ranch experience?" she said. "I can learn." "That's not what I asked." "No," Caleb said. "I don't have ranch experience." She looked at him for another moment, then she turned, untied her horse from the post, and swung up into the saddle with the automatic, unthinking ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood. "There's a supply wagon coming behind me," she said, not looking at him. "You'll ride with the driver. Don't talk much. He doesn't like conversation." "Miss Thorne, I need to think," she said, and she rode away. Sit. Chapter 2. Thorn Ridge. The supply wagon driver's name was Hobbs, and he had not lied about the conversation. He was a man of maybe 60, built low and wide, with a white beard that appeared to have been trimmed with a hunting knife sometime in the previous month. He said 4 words to Caleb during the entire 2-hour ride up the mountain. Get up there when Caleb was climbing onto the wagon bench, and watch your head when they passed under a low-hanging branch loaded with snow. That was it. Everything else was silence, wind, the creak of the wagon, and the steady, plodding rhythm of the 2 draft horses pulling them up a road that seemed less like a road and more like a theory. The mountains were enormous. Caleb had seen mountains before. He'd traveled through the Rockies twice on trains, but seeing them from a warm train window and sitting exposed on a wagon bench while they rose on all sides of you were completely different experiences. The peaks above them were hidden in low cloud, and the pine forest pressing in from both sides of the road was dark and dense and made sounds he couldn't identify. Somewhere in those trees, something moved. A heavy, deliberate movement that Hobbs didn't react to at all, which Caleb decided to take as reassuring. By the time the wagon crested the last rise and the ranch came into view, Caleb's hands were numb even inside his gloves, and he had run completely out of the particular kind of optimism that travels well. Thorn Ridge Ranch was not what he had imagined either, although this time he'd had the advantage of the train ride to construct something specific, and specific was what he'd done wrong. He had pictured something rough but functional, the kind of modest frontier operation that featured in the magazine illustrations he'd grown up looking at, with a solid farmhouse and a neat red barn, and maybe a few cows standing around looking picturesque. What he got was a working ranch in the middle of a hard winter, which looked nothing like a magazine illustration and everything like a war someone was barely winning. The main house was solid enough. 2 stories of dark timber, low-roofed against the snow, with smoke coming from 2 chimneys and light in the lower windows. But the barn needed repairs. He could see that even in the fading afternoon light, and there were 3 outbuildings of varying states of structural confidence. The fencing along the main yard was a patchwork of old posts and newer ones, as if sections had been replaced as they failed. There was equipment everywhere, half covered by snow. Somewhere behind the barn, cattle were moving and making noise, and several horses were visible in the near paddock, watching the wagon arrive with the alert disinterest of animals that had seen a lot of newcomers and had opinions about most of them. 3 men came out of the bunkhouse as the wagon pulled in. They stopped when they saw Caleb climb down, and they did not bother to make their reactions subtle. The tallest one, raw-boned, maybe 40, with a jaw like a piece of furniture, looked at Caleb and then looked at the other 2 men beside him. "That's the one?" he said. The one on his left made a sound that might have been a laugh. Eliza rode in from the far end of the yard, dismounted, and handed her horse's reins to the 3rd man without looking away from Caleb. "This is Caleb Mercer," she said, to no one in particular and to everyone. "He'll be staying for now." "For now," the tall one repeated, with an emphasis that made the words mean something specific. That's what I said, Garrett. Her tone was flat, not angry, just final. Get the supplies in before it gets dark, and somebody show him where to put his things. She walked into the house without looking back. Garrett looked at Caleb for a long moment. You ride? He said. Some. Cattle? No. Timber? No. You know how to swing an axe, fix a fence, treat a sick animal, cook for a crew? I can cook, Caleb said. Some things. Garrett's expression was not unkind exactly. It was just honest in a way that Caleb's Boston life hadn't prepared him for. That particular frontier honesty that doesn't dress itself up or soften its corners. Son, he said, I don't know what your story is, but this ranch doesn't carry passengers. You understand me? Whatever arrangement the boss lady made, it doesn't put food in anyone's mouth unless you're out here working for it. I understand, Caleb said. Garrett picked up the heaviest supply crate from the wagon as if it weighed nothing, turned, and walked away. The other two men followed without speaking. Hobbs climbed down from the wagon bench, unhitched the horses with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and paused beside Caleb on his way past. He looked at Caleb's feet, still in the ruined dress shoes, dark with snowmelt, and then looked at his face. Bunkhouse is that way, Hobbs said. Ask for a bunk near the stove. That was the most generous thing anyone said to Caleb Mercer on his first night at Thorn Ridge Ranch. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Agreement. Dinner that night was beans, salt pork, and cornbread eaten in a room that smelled of wood smoke and wet wool. The ranch hands, Garrett, a younger man named Cole, who couldn't have been older than 19, and a quiet, heavy-set man who went by Dunmore, ate at the long table in the bunkhouse. Caleb ate with them, which was not a comfortable experience. They didn't ignore him. That would have been easier. They watched him, not constantly, but in that intermittent evaluating way that felt like being assessed and found wanting on a rolling basis. When he poured coffee and spilled some, Cole covered a smile. When he asked where the outhouse was and had to be told twice because he initially went the wrong direction in the dark, Dunmore said nothing, but his silence had a quality to it. Caleb ate his beans and said almost nothing, and told himself this was temporary. He was still telling himself that when Eliza knocked on the bunkhouse door an hour after dinner and said, Mercer, inside. The main house was warmer than the bunkhouse, and better lit, and the contrast was enough to make the cold outside feel even more absolute. Eliza's kitchen was functional rather than comfortable. A large iron stove, a heavy table, shelves of provisions, everything placed for use rather than appearance. She was sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, and the original partnership agreement was open in front of her. Caleb sat across from her and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, which was the most grateful he had felt about anything since stepping off the train. The agreement, Eliza said, not looking up, was made with Adrian Mercer. He brought investment capital and ranch experience. The arrangement was a working partnership with a shared stake in the ranch. She paused. I need you to understand what that means. I've been running this place alone for 3 years since my father died. I have debt I can't service without a capital injection, a hay shortage that's going to become critical in 6 weeks, and a north fence line that needs to be rebuilt before spring thaw makes the pasture indefensible. She looked up. I arranged this partnership because I had no other option. I want to be clear about that. I appreciate the honesty, Caleb said. I'm not being kind. I'm telling you the situation because you need to understand what you walked into. She looked at the agreement. Adrian Mercer had $12,000 committed to this partnership. I have already borrowed against the expectation of that money. When you tell me you have no ranch experience, that's one problem. When I ask myself whether you have access to those funds, I don't, Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. I have about $400, he said, give or take. The silence that followed had texture. Caleb watched Eliza's jaw tighten and then deliberately release. She looked out at the window at the dark. She picked up her coffee cup, held it, set it down without drinking. Everything she was not saying was very loud. $400, she said finally. Yes. Your brother? Why didn't he come? What actually happened? Caleb looked at the table. Adrian decided the opportunity wasn't worth the inconvenience of traveling to Wyoming in winter. He had a better offer elsewhere. And my father, he stopped. The next part was harder to say. Not because it surprised him, but because saying it out loud in front of a stranger made it real, in a different way than just knowing it. My father decided that since the commitment had already been made, someone from the family should honor it, and I was the one available. Available, she repeated. Expendable was the word I'd have used, but my father's lawyer was more polite about it. She looked at him then, really looked at him, which she hadn't quite done since the platform at Coldwater Station. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. It wasn't sympathy. It was more like recognition of a specific kind of damage that she had some experience with herself. I need someone who can work, she said. Hard work, every day, in conditions that are going to get worse before they get better. I need someone who isn't going to run when it gets difficult, and it is going to get difficult. She paused. I need to know if you are actually capable of that, or if you are going to waste my time. I don't know if I'm capable of it, Caleb said. She blinked. I've never done any of this. I don't know how I'll handle it. I think it would be dishonest to tell you I'm certain I can do what you need. He put his hands flat on the table. What I can tell you is that I have nowhere else to go. My family sent me here because they didn't want me in Boston. There's no job waiting for me, no one expecting me back, no other option I haven't already tried. He met her eyes. You said you had no other option when you made this arrangement. I'm in the same position. Maybe that's enough of a foundation to try. It was the most he'd said at one time all day. He felt exposed saying it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simply true, and the truth of it sat between them on that kitchen table like something neither of them had planned to put there. Eliza was quiet for a long time. There are rules, she said finally. All right. You work every day. No exceptions unless you're running a genuine fever, and even then you check with me first. You do what you're told by Garrett in the field until you know enough to think for yourself, which could be a very long time. You don't touch the horses without permission until you know what you're doing. The cattle are not a learning opportunity. They are the difference between this ranch surviving and not surviving, and I will not have them stressed or mishandled by someone who doesn't know better. Understood. If you quit, if you pack that bag and walk down the mountain, the agreement terminates and you leave with nothing. I keep whatever you brought with you monetarily, as compensation for time spent. She picked up the agreement. I want that amendment added before you sign. Add it, Caleb said. She looked at him again. You're not going to argue that. I'm not planning on quitting. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she pulled a pen from the inside of her jacket and wrote the amendment in the margin of the document, clear and careful. She signed it. She slid it across the table. Caleb signed it. Breakfast is at 5, Eliza said. Garrett will tell you what you're doing. Don't be late. She picked up the cups, took them to the sink, and when she looked back at him over her shoulder, her expression was not warm. But it was not dismissive anymore either. It was something harder than either of those things. The look of a woman who had made a bet she wasn't sure about and had decided to let it ride anyway, because the alternative was worse. You should get some sleep, she said. It's going to be a rough morning. Well, Chapter 4, First Blood. It was a rough morning. It began at 4:47 a.m. When the bunkhouse stove had burned down to almost nothing, and the cold had reached the kind of temperature that made the inside of your nose feel like the air itself was made of small knives. Garrett shook Caleb awake with approximately the tenderness of a man moving furniture. Caleb had slept in his clothes. He'd been too cold to do otherwise, and he sat up in the dim light of the bunkhouse trying to locate his boots and wondering if he was actually awake or if this was some specific type of nightmare he hadn't encountered before. You've got 10 minutes, Garrett said. Then the food's gone. The food was oatmeal and black coffee and biscuits that were excellent. They were Dunmore's contribution, as it turned out. The man was a genuinely gifted camp cook and seemed to take a certain quiet pride in it. And Caleb ate standing up because sitting down was starting to feel like commitment he wasn't ready for. Outside, the temperature was somewhere around 15 degrees and falling. The sky was the specific dark blue of very early morning, before any warmth has touched it, and the snow in the yard had crusted overnight so that every step broke through a thin, icy layer and crunched with an audible crack. The horses in the near paddock were moving, steaming, their breath rising in white clouds. Garrett pointed Caleb at a pile of fence posts stacked beside the barn. Start with these, he said. We need 40 posts moved to the north gate. Load them in the sled. He gestured at a flat wooden sled behind the barn. You'll need... He stopped, reconsidered, and explained in brief, precise terms exactly what Caleb would need to do. It sounded simple. It was not simple. The fence posts were heavy in the way that raw timber is heavy. Dense, unpredictable, awkward to grip, and completely indifferent to the discomfort of whoever is trying to move them. They were also frozen together in places, so the first task was separating them, which required a pry bar that Garrett handed him without explanation and which Caleb used in several wrong ways before finding a method that worked. His back began hurting almost immediately. His hands, in work gloves he'd bought at the last supply store before boarding the train, stiff gloves that hadn't been broken in, blistered on the inside of his right thumb by the fourth post. He moved 43 posts that morning. Garrett had said 40, and Caleb moved 43 because he'd lost count twice and didn't want to come up short. By the time he finished, the sun had come up over the eastern ridge and the temperature had risen maybe 5 degrees, and Cole came by on his way to the paddock, looked at Caleb standing beside the loaded sled breathing hard, and said, "How's your back?" "Fine," Caleb said, which was a complete lie. "That's all right," Cole said with something that might have been almost friendly. "Nobody's back is fine on the first week. Give it 3 months, it stops hurting so much." He paused, then added with the careful honesty of someone who didn't want to give false hope. "Mostly." After the post came water, carrying water from the creek to the stock tanks because the pump was frozen, which was 400 yards each way with 2 full buckets, and Caleb did it 11 times before Garrett called him off. Then came mucking out one of the stable stalls, which he will not describe in detail except to say that it was an education, and that Dunmore, watching him from the stable doorway while he worked, ate an apple with the unhurried satisfaction of a man watching entertainment he had not paid for. "You're holding the fork wrong," Dunmore said. "I know," Caleb said. "You're not going to ask me how to hold it, right?" Caleb straightened, looked at Dunmore, and held out the fork. "Show me." That surprised Dunmore. His expression changed, not to warmth exactly, but to something that was at least in its vicinity. He came in, adjusted the grip, demonstrated the motion twice. "Like that," he said. "Your whole back isn't in it that way." "Thank you." Dunmore looked at him for a moment, then walked back out without another word. But as he went, he ate the last of his apple with a slightly different quality of silence. Lunch was inside the barn, sandwiches and cold coffee, because it was too cold to sit outside and too much going on to break for the bunkhouse. Caleb sat on a hay bale and unwrapped his sandwich with hands that were trembling slightly from exhaustion and cold, and he noticed that the blister on his thumb had burst sometime during the water hauling and had rubbed the raw skin underneath into something that stung with every movement. Eliza came through the barn during lunch. She was checking one of the horses, a gray mare that had been favoring her left foreleg since yesterday, apparently, and she moved through the space with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She crouched beside the mare's leg, ran her hands down it, stood. She glanced at Caleb. He was looking at his hand, at the blister which was bleeding very slightly. He caught her looking and reflexively tried to close his hand, which hurt enough that he stopped. "Let me see," she said, walking over. "It's fine." "I didn't ask if it was fine." She held out her hand, and when he didn't immediately respond, she simply took his wrist and turned his hand over. She looked at the blister with the same diagnostic expression she'd used on the mare's leg. "You didn't bring proper work gloves." "No." "I'll have Cole find you some extras. Keep that clean, or it'll get infected, and then you'll have a real problem." She released his wrist. "How's everything else?" He looked at her steadily. "Fine." She looked at him for a beat, long enough that he thought she was going to say something. Then she just nodded once and went back to the mare. It was the second time that day that a small thing felt, unexpectedly, like a lot. Chapter 5. What the Mountain Costs. By the end of the first week, Caleb had fallen off a horse twice, driven a fence post crooked 4 times out of 6 and had to dig them out and redo them, accidentally spooked 3 cattle into the wrong pasture in a sequence of events that Garrett described afterward with the expression of a man narrating a natural disaster, and narrowly avoided dropping a 200-pound hay bale directly onto Cole, who had reflexes fast enough to sidestep and charitable enough to find the whole thing funny afterward rather than furious. But he had not quit. and he had not asked for anything to be easier. That was the thing that Garrett noticed first, and noticed in the particular way that men who've spent their lives working hard notice the same quality, or its absence, in the people around them. He mentioned it to Dunmore one evening in the bunkhouse, in the oblique, understated way of men who didn't speak their observations directly. "City boy didn't complain today," he said. "Nope," Dunmore said. "Hauled the east water twice in the afternoon when Cole's knee went out. I saw. Didn't say anything about it. Also saw that." They sat with that for a moment. "Doesn't mean he knows anything," Garrett said. "No," Dunmore agreed, "but it means he might learn." Caleb, sleeping in the next bunk and not quite as asleep as he appeared, heard this. He filed it under the small things that mattered more than they should have and kept his eyes closed. The nights were the hardest part, and not just because of the cold. In the day there was always something, always the next task, the next physical demand, the next thing to figure out or fail at or have corrected. But at night, when the bunkhouse stove had settled into its low burn and Garrett and Cole and Dunmore were all asleep, Caleb lay in the dark and felt the specific weight of where he actually was. He had been discarded by his own family with less ceremony than most people gave to old furniture. He was sleeping in a bunkhouse on a mountain in Wyoming because there was literally nowhere else for him to go. The woman whose ranch he was contractually connected to regarded him with at most cautious disappointment and at least the kind of assessment you gave a tool you weren't sure was the right size for the job. And yet, he had moved those posts. He had hauled that water. He had shoveled that stall and fixed 3 fence posts correctly out of 3 when he finally understood how to do it properly. And when he'd gotten it right the 3rd time and tamped the earth solid around the base and stepped back to look, there was something in that moment, the post straight and solid in the frozen ground, that he recognized as a feeling he had not felt very often in his adult life. The feeling was small and quiet, and he almost missed it. I made that. Not a report, not a calculation on a ledger page, not a task completed on behalf of someone else's name on a door. Just a fence post, straight in the ground, doing the job it was put there to do. He didn't know what to do with that feeling yet, but he put it somewhere careful and let it stay. Chapter 6. The Barn. The incident with the barn happened on the 11th day. A storm had been building since morning, the kind of heavy, purposeful mountain snowstorm that Garrett had explained with characteristic brevity. Those clouds mean 2 feet by morning, so we've got today to secure things. The cattle had to be brought in from the north pasture. The feed had to be moved from the exposed east storage into the main barn, and the barn's south door, which had a broken latch that had been temporarily fixed twice and had unfixed itself again, needed to be properly repaired before the wind picked up. Caleb was assigned the south door. Garrett showed him what needed to be done in about 45 seconds and then left, because there were 17 things happening simultaneously, and the south door was the least of them. What Garrett did not know, and what Caleb discovered 15 minutes into the job, was that the door frame itself had partially rotted where the hinge mounted, which meant that the entire hinge was pulling free from soft, compromised wood. The latch wasn't the real problem. The hinge was the real problem. By the time he figured this out, the wind had picked up significantly, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. His hands were cold and clumsy. The light was going. And when he went to find Garrett to explain the situation, Garrett was in the north pasture with Cole dealing with a calf that had gotten stuck in a drift and was not going to be interrupted. Caleb stood outside the barn in the building wind and looked at the door problem for a long moment. Then he went to the tool shed, found what he thought he needed, and went back. He worked for 2.5 hours. He was wrong about his approach twice, and figured out he was wrong both times by the evidence of the result rather than any theoretical knowledge. He went back to the tool shed twice for different materials. His hands were bleeding from a slip with a chisel at one point, just a small cut, not serious, but the cold made it hurt more than it should have, and he kept working. When Garrett came back from the north pasture and pushed open the barn doors to check the status, he found Caleb inside kneeling in the straw, cleaning up. The south door was closed and latched. He looked at the door, then at the hinges, then at the reinforced frame around them. He crouched and looked closer. He ran his thumb along the work. "You replaced the frame section?" he said. "Parts of it, where it was rotted." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He stood, pushed the door against its latch, tried to rattle it. It held. He He tried harder. It held. Who taught you to do that? Nobody. I looked at what was wrong and figured out what had to be done. Garrett turned and looked at him. A different kind of looking than he'd done on that first night when he'd asked Caleb what he knew and listed everything he didn't. This was more like the look you gave something that had surprised you and you weren't sure yet how to account for it. Roof support on the east wall needs attention, Garrett said. I haven't had time. He paused. Could use someone to look at it tomorrow. All right, Caleb said. Garrett nodded once. He walked to the other end of the barn and started checking the cattle without another word. But it was a different silence than before. Bounce. Chapter 7. Things Left Unsaid. Eliza did not come to the barn that night, but the next morning, when Caleb came into the kitchen for the early coffee, the bunkhouse arrangement included an hour before the hands arrived, where he and Eliza would sometimes both be in the kitchen at the same time, not by design but by circumstance. She was already there, standing at the stove. Without turning around, she said, Garrett told me about the door. It needed doing. He said you spent 2.5 hours in the wind getting it right. It took that long. She poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table in front of his usual chair. She sat across from him with her own cup, and for a moment they just sat there in the particular quiet of early morning, when the ranch was still warming up and the day hadn't started being brutal yet. My father built this ranch, she said. It wasn't directed at anything specific, not a response to what had been said, just a thing she was saying. He got here before the big cattle operations, before the land was properly settled. He built the main house himself, him and 2 other men, over 3 winters. She looked at her coffee. He died owing money to 4 different people. The ranch was his whole life, and he still couldn't make it fully work. I'm sorry, Caleb said. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because... She paused, and he could see her deciding whether to continue. She was not a woman who spoke easily about things that mattered. That was obvious even in 2 weeks. Because I want you to understand why I can't afford for this to fail. It's not just money, it's... She stopped again. It's his, Caleb said quietly. She looked at him. It's his work, and you're keeping it alive, he said. That's not the same as just money. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from her other silences. Those were the silences of a woman who had decided not to speak. This was the silence of someone who was surprised that something accurate had been said about them and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Garrett's going to have you on the east wall roof support today, she said, pulling back to practical ground. He mentioned, don't fall. I'll try my best. Trying is not the same as not falling. Pay attention to the ice. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes flicked to his face, and for just a moment, brief enough that he might have imagined it, something in her expression moved in a direction that wasn't quite the evaluating look she'd been giving him for 2 weeks. It was small. It was careful. It was there, and then it wasn't. She stood, took her cup to the sink. 5 minutes, she said, which was her standard method of ending conversations. Caleb drank his coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the mountain, white and gray and completely indifferent, and thought, I am still here. He had not expected to still be here. He was not certain what that meant, but it meant something. Outside, the day was beginning. The cold was waiting. The ranch needed things done that he only half knew how to do. Somewhere above the cloud line, the mountain was exactly what it had always been, enormous and patient and entirely unimpressed. Caleb finished his coffee, put on his coat, and went out to meet it. The east wall roof support did not go smoothly. It never went smoothly. Nothing on Thornridge Ranch went smoothly, because smoothly was a word that belonged to a different kind of life. But this particular job had the added quality of being genuinely dangerous in a way that the fence posts and the water hauling and even the barn door hadn't been, because it required Caleb to climb onto an icy roof in wind that was still gusting from yesterday's storm, with tools he was learning to use correctly only by using them incorrectly first. He fell once, not off the roof, not all the way, but his left boot went out from under him on a patch of ice near the ridge, and he went down hard on one knee and one hand, and for a very specific 3 seconds he was sliding toward the edge with nothing to grab. His right hand found a nail head and held. He lay flat on the roof, breathing, while the wind pushed at him with its cold, impersonal insistence, and he thought very clearly and without drama, that was close. Then he got back up and finished the job. Cole had been below, ostensibly handling the feed stores but in practice watching the roof, with the look of someone who had been quietly assigned to be nearby in case something went wrong. When Caleb came down the ladder, Cole handed him a rag for his bleeding palm. The nailhead had done some damage, without comment, and that was the entirety of the incident as it was acknowledged between them. But Cole told Dunmore that evening, and Dunmore told Garrett, and by the following morning it had become one of those small stories that circulate through a working crew the way small stories do. Not dramatically, not with embellishment, just passed from person to person as a data point about the man they were forming opinions of. Caleb didn't know this until 2 days later, when Garrett handed him a better pair of roof boots from the equipment shed. An old pair, well broken in, sized close enough, and said simply, "These'll grip better." He didn't say it was because of the fall. He didn't need to. The weeks after that had a rhythm that was brutal and consistent, and slowly, reluctantly, began to feel like something he understood. He still failed at things. He misread a calf's behavior one afternoon and got kicked hard enough in the thigh that the bruise lasted 3 weeks and turned colors that he hadn't known bruises could achieve. He overloaded the sled twice in the same week. He took the wrong fork on a supply run and added an hour to the trip in falling snow. And when he came back, Garrett looked at him and said, "There's a blaze mark on the south pine at the junction. You see it?" And Caleb said, "I see it now." And Garrett said, "Good." And that was that. But he was learning. Not quickly, and not gracefully, and not without cost. But learning in the way things learned on the mountain, through being wrong, through consequence, through trying again, with the correction built into muscle and habit. The cold reached into February and stopped pretending to soften. Some mornings the temperature was close to 0, and the air had a clarity to it that was almost violent, every edge sharp and the sky so blue it looked artificial. Cole said this kind of cold was the mountain's way of sorting things out, which Caleb thought was a reasonable description. The cattle needed more attention in the deep cold, checking their water constantly, watching for the early signs of respiratory trouble, pushing extra hay into the shelter areas. He was part of that rotation now, which was Garrett's decision, and which Garrett conveyed not with any announcement, but simply by including Caleb's name on the morning assignment board. It was the first time his name had appeared there without the word "with" followed by someone else's name. Eliza noticed. She noticed most things about the ranch, which was the quality of someone who had been solely responsible for all of it for a long time and had developed a kind of peripheral attention that never fully shut off. She said nothing about it directly, but that morning she poured his coffee before he reached for the pot and set it down at his place without looking at him, and he understood that this was the closest thing to acknowledgement she was inclined to offer. They had developed, without discussing it, a kind of language between them that was not words. She would come into the barn in the evening on the pretext of checking the mare, and he would be there finishing the last of the day's work. And they would sometimes talk, genuinely talk, not the brief practical exchanges of the workday, about things that were not entirely the ranch. She told him once, unprompted, that she had wanted to study plant biology, had been accepted to a program in Denver, and had come home for her father's illness and never left. She said it without self-pity, as a fact about the shape her life had taken, and then went back to the mare and did not bring it up again. He told her about the counting house in Boston, about the desk that was never going to be his, and the work he'd done well for 4 years without any acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement would have implied a permanence that his employer had never intended. He told it flatly, the way she told her story, without asking for anything about it. And she listened with the quality of attention she gave to things she was actually interested in, focused, still, without the polite half-attention of someone waiting for you to finish. "You were good at it?" she said. "The accounting." "Yes," he said. "I was good at it." "Then why did your family send you here instead of using that?" He looked at his hands, rougher now, the blisters calloused over and new ones building on top of the old. "Because Adrian is better at the things they care about, better at being in a room, better at being the person you notice first." He paused. "And I was easier to lose." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's a wrong way to see yourself." "Maybe," he said, "but it's accurate." She looked at him and he could see her thinking about whether to push at that, and then deciding against it, which was both disappointing and right. Neither of them was the type for unsolicited reassurance, and he would not have trusted it from her anyway. But she set the mare's brush down, turned to face him directly, and said, "The north pasture fence is going to need surveying in the spring thaw. I'll need someone who can read a grade and calculate posts per yard. Can you do that? Yes, he said. That's basically applied geometry. I can do that. Good. She picked the brush back up. Then we'll deal with the other part later. He didn't ask which part she meant. He thought he knew. March came in mean and stayed that way, and it was in March that Cole got hurt. It was a chain reaction the way most ranch accidents were. Not one dramatic mistake, but a sequence of small things. A gate left unlatched during a wind gust, two bulls that weren't supposed to be in the same pasture, suddenly in the same pasture, Cole in the wrong place when the chaos shook out. The goring was not severe. His left side, below the ribs, deep enough to need stitching, but not deep enough to threaten anything vital. But getting Cole out of the pasture and into the ranch house and cleaned up and sutured was a 30-minute sequence that required everyone to be doing three things at once. And when it was done, and Cole was lying white-faced on the kitchen table while Eliza worked with a needle and thread, the ranch had lost its third man for at minimum 2 weeks. Garrett stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the ceiling and then at Eliza and said, "We still need the lower hay moved before it gets wet." "I know," Eliza said, not looking up from Cole's side. "That's a 2-man job at minimum." "I know, Garrett. There's only—" I said, "I know." Her voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone running the numbers in their head at the same time as everything else. She tied off the suture, pressed a folded cloth to Cole's side, and looked at Caleb, who was standing near the stove with hay chaff still on his coat from pulling Cole out. "How's your shoulder?" Cole had landed on him during the extraction. The shoulder was not great, but it was functional. "Fine," Caleb said. "You and Dunmore can do the lower hay. You'll need to start before light." "All right." Cole made a sound from the table that might have been a protest. "Quiet," Eliza told him, and began wrapping the wound. Caleb and Dunmore started the lower hay at 4 in the morning, 2 days into a cold snap that had come back sharp after a week of relative warmth, and the work was exactly as hard as it sounded. Moving 3 months' worth of stacked hay from a low-lying storage area to the main barn's upper level before the spring melt got under it. It took 2 full days. At the end of the first day, Dunmore sat on a hay bale and looked at his hands and then at Caleb and said, "You know what I thought when you got off that supply wagon in January? Cheeky mate, what's I need?" "I can guess," Caleb said. "I thought 6 days, maybe 8. City boy'll fold." He rubbed his palms together. "Garrett gave you 4 days." "What did Cole say?" Dunmore's expression shifted in a direction that was almost a smile. "Cole said you'd make it. Kid's got good instincts." He paused. "He said you had the look of someone with nothing to go back to, and those are the ones who either break completely or don't break at all." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "How long did Hobbs give me?" Hobbs said 3 weeks, but only because he was feeling generous. Dunmore stood, stretched his back with a sound like splitting firewood. "You've been here 2 months." 2 months and 9 days, Caleb said. "Counting, are you?" "Habit. I used to count things for a living." Dunmore looked at him with that quality he sometimes had, the quiet man's quality of actually registering what was said, and holding it for a moment before responding. "You miss it? The counting house?" The honest answer was no, which surprised Caleb every time he got close to examining it, because he'd thought he would. But missing the work assumed the work had given him something worth missing. It had given him a paycheck and a sense of competence and absolutely nothing else. "No," he said. "Not much." "Mountain'll do that," Dunmore said, which was the most philosophical thing he'd ever said in Caleb's presence. And then he picked up his work gloves and went back to the hay. On the second evening, when the last load was secured and Caleb and Dunmore came into the barn's main floor smelling of dust and labor, Eliza was there. She had been doing evening rounds. She always did evening rounds. But she stopped when they came in and looked at the hay stacked solid and dry in the upper level, and then she looked at the two of them. "Good," she said. It was one word. But from Eliza Thorne, on a ranch where everything had to be earned and nothing was performed, one word was enough. What Caleb did not expect was that the hardest part of that period would not be the physical work. He'd adapted to the physical work. His body had changed. He'd gained weight in his shoulders and hands, lost it everywhere soft, and the cold that had hit him like a wall on the platform at Coldwater Station was now something he moved through rather than something that moved through him. He slept better than he had in years. He was tired in the right way. The kind of tired that came from spending the day completely, rather than spending it on tasks that drained without filling. No, the hardest part was the nights when the wind came down off the high peaks and pushed against the bunkhouse walls hard enough that the boards flexed, and he lay awake thinking about his father. Not with anger, particularly. More with a kind of hollow clarity. The understanding that certain people would look at him standing in that barn, having secured that hay, having fixed that door, and repaired that roof support, and hauled that water through 2 months of Wyoming winter, and would still see only the one who had been sent away. That no amount of work done at altitude on a mountain they'd never visit would change the particular arithmetic of his family's regard. He didn't talk about this to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you said in a bunkhouse, and he didn't have the language for it even if it had been. But on one of those nights, he heard Eliza cross the yard. He knew her footstep by then, light and direct. And the main house door open and close, and a light come on in the kitchen window, which happened sometimes when she couldn't sleep. He thought about the things she'd said about her father building this ranch, about the way she'd deflected when he'd accurately named what the ranch was to her. He thought, she is doing the same thing at that kitchen table that I'm doing in this bunk. Running the numbers, counting the ways it could fail, sitting with the weight of what was expected and what was real. He did not get up. He did not go to the kitchen. There are moments that are exactly right as they are, and this was one of them. Two people on the same piece of land awake in the dark, carrying the same question from different sides. Whether the answer would ever be the same, he didn't know. What he knew was that he was still here. 2 months and 9 days on a mountain that had broken every easy man who'd tried it, and he was still here, blistered and bruised and occasionally wrong, but present and working and slowly, imperfectly, becoming something he didn't have a word for yet. The mountain didn't offer opinions about that. It just kept going, cold and enormous and patient as stone. And somewhere in its silences, if he listened right, he thought he could hear something that sounded almost like an answer. Spring came to Thorn Ridge the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze. Snow that melted by afternoon and refroze by midnight into a treacherous shell that broke under a boot heel at exactly the wrong moment. The North Pasture fence survey that Eliza had mentioned in February became Caleb's primary project through the first weeks of April, and he took to it with the precision that 4 years of accounting had built into him. Methodical, exact, unhurried. He walked every yard of that fence line with a notebook, recorded grades and post conditions and gap distances, and came back with a report that was clear enough that Garrett read it twice, and then said, with the expression of a man revising a previously held opinion, "This is useful." Cole was back on his feet by mid-March, moving carefully and complaining about it only to Dunmore, who had the patience for it. The crew had settled into a kind of rhythm that included Caleb without ceremony. He was on the assignment board every morning now, assigned to tasks based on what the ranch needed rather than what a newcomer could be trusted with, which was a distinction that mattered more than any formal acknowledgement. He still made mistakes. He always would. But they were the mistakes of someone learning the work, not the mistakes of someone who didn't understand what the work was for. Something had shifted between him and Eliza, too, though neither of them had named it or would have been comfortable naming it. The kitchen mornings were longer than they used to be. The practical conversations about the ranch ran longer, turned into other conversations. So, about the Haymarket, about a book she was reading on pasture management, about a problem with the South well that turned into a 40-minute discussion of hydrology that neither of them had planned on having. She still kept her distance, and he still kept his, but the distance had changed shape. It was no longer the distance of a woman managing an unwanted guest. It was the distance of two people who had learned to be careful with things they were only starting to understand. He was thinking about this, imprecisely, the way you think about things you haven't organized yet. On a Tuesday morning in late April, when Hobbs came up the road with the supply wagon and something else. A second vehicle, a hired carriage from Coldwater Station, black and city clean in a way that looked wrong against the mud of the spring road. Caleb was in the yard when it pulled in. He straightened. He knew before the door opened. Adrian Mercer stepped out of that carriage the way he stepped into every room, with the automatic assurance of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that his arrival was anything other than an event. He was taller than Caleb by 2 inches, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of looks that got described in words like distinguished when the man was older and golden when he was young. He was 31, and he still got golden. He wore a coat that cost more than Caleb's entire Boston wardrobe, and he looked at Thornridge Ranch with the evaluating eye of someone pricing property. Then he saw Caleb and stopped. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. Not his younger brother standing in the yard of a Wyoming ranch in worn work clothes and mountain boots, looking, and Adrian's expression said this clearly, though he recovered fast, like he actually belonged there. "Caleb," he said. "Adrian." A beat of silence. Adrian took in the details, the calluses, the different posture, the way Caleb was standing in the mud without appearing to notice it, with the quick cataloging intelligence that had always been one of his genuine qualities. Then he smiled, and the smile was warm and real, and the thing that had always made Adrian so effective at everything that required charm, because it was not entirely performed. "You look terrible," Adrian said. "You look like you hired that carriage by the week," Caleb said. Adrian actually laughed at that. For a moment they were just brothers, which was the most complicated thing they had ever been. Then the carriage door opened again and a second man stepped out, 50s, gray-suited, carrying a leather document case, and the moment closed. "This is Mr. Hale," Adrian said. "He's been handling the legal aspects of the partnership arrangement." He paused, and something in his tone shifted to the register he used for business. Still warm, still easy, but with a structure under it now. "We need to speak with Miss Thorne." Eliza had come out of the main house. She must have heard the carriage, or seen it from the window, because she was already on the porch steps with her arms crossed, and an expression that Caleb recognized as the face she wore when she was being very careful about what she let show. She looked at Adrian Mercer, and she looked at the lawyer, and she looked at Caleb, briefly, with something in her eyes that he couldn't fully read. "Miss Thorne," Adrian said, walking forward with his hand extended. "I'm Adrian Mercer. I apologize that my arrival here was delayed. Circumstances were—" "I know who you are," Eliza said. She shook his hand because not shaking it would have been a declaration she wasn't ready to make in the first 10 seconds. "Come inside." The kitchen that had become, over 4 months, a space that felt almost ordinary to Caleb became something else entirely, with Adrian Mercer sitting at the table. Adrian had the quality of a man who occupied rooms differently than other people. He didn't dominate them exactly, but he arranged them around himself without trying, the way water finds the low point. He set his hat on the table and leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen with genuine interest, which was worse somehow than if he'd looked dismissive. "This is a solid operation," he said. "The approach roads need work, but the main structure is good. Good bones." "It's not a building project," Eliza said. She was at the stove, not sitting. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" Mr. Hale set the document case on the table and opened it. "Miss Thorne, the original partnership agreement names Adrian Mercer as the Mercer family signatory. Whatever arrangement was made with your current—" He glanced at Caleb, who was standing near the door with his hat in his hands, not sitting either. "Associate, the legal instrument of the agreement designates my client. We're here to establish the correct partnership as written." The room was quiet for a moment. "The agreement was amended," Eliza said. "Miss Thorne, the amendment was made under circumstances that our legal review suggests may not hold. A representative sent in another signatory's name without—" "He signed. I signed. A witness signed." Her voice was flat and controlled. "That's an amendment. Our position," Hale said carefully, "is that the original signatory's rights were not extinguished by that amendment. That Adrian Mercer retains a legal claim to the partnership terms as written, including the capital investment provisions and the operational stake." Eliza looked at the lawyer. Then she looked at Adrian. "And what's your position?" she said. Not to the lawyer, to the— Adrian was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just thinking. He had the particular quality of genuinely intelligent people who could sit with a hard question without needing to fill the space. "My position," he said, "is that I'm here because this is a legitimate opportunity and because I made a commitment that I didn't honor on schedule. I'm here to correct that." He looked at Caleb. "No offense to my brother intended." "None taken," Caleb said, which was not true. "The capital commitment still stands," Adrian continued, $12,000, which I understand this ranch needs, which I understand—" He looked at Eliza with a frankness that was one of his more genuine qualities. "Was part of why you agreed to this arrangement in the first place." Eliza said nothing for a moment. Caleb watched her jaw set and release the same small motion he'd seen on his first night in this kitchen when he told her he had $400. She was doing math, complicated math, and not the kind that involved numbers. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," Adrian said, standing smoothly. "We'll be in Coldwater for a few days. There's no immediate urgency." He picked up his hat, nodded to Eliza with genuine courtesy. He looked at Caleb. "Walk me out?" They stood in the yard in the weak April sunlight, the mud soft under their boots, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You really fixed this place up," Adrian said, looking around. He meant it as a compliment. That was somehow the worst part. "The ranch did most of it," Caleb said. "How are you, honestly?" Caleb looked at him. Adrian's concern was real. It was always real, which made it complicated. Adrian had never disliked Caleb. He had simply never noticed him in any way that counted. "Better than I've been in a while," Caleb said, which I know is strange given the circumstances. "It's not strange." Adrian looked at the mountains. "I should have come in January, I know that. The timing was—" "Don't," Caleb said, quietly, without heat. Adrian stopped. "Don't tell me why it wasn't the right time. I know why it wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right time because I was easier to send." Caleb kept his voice level. "That's the truth and we both know it. I'm not angry about it, Adrian. I'm past being angry about it. But don't dress it up for me." A long pause. Adrian looked at his hat in his hands. For a moment he looked less like the Golden Brother and more like a man who knew something accurate had been said about him and was sitting with the discomfort of it. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "What do you actually want?" Caleb said. "Not what Hale wants. What do you want?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I want the partnership. I want the stake in the ranch. I think it's a sound investment, and I think I can make it better." He looked at Caleb. "I also want to know what you want, which is something I should have asked before." It was the most honest thing Adrian had said to him in years. Caleb held it for a moment, then set it aside because honesty from Adrian was a beginning, not a resolution, and right now it changed nothing about the actual problem. "I want to finish what I started," Caleb said. "That's all." Adrian nodded slowly. Then he got back into the hired carriage, and Hale followed, and Caleb stood in the yard and watched it go down the mountain road until it disappeared around the tree line. Garrett came up beside him. The foreman had been at the fence line and had come in to find a lawyer's carriage in his yard, and his expression had the quality of a man who'd found something unpleasant under a rock he'd turned over. "That the brother?" Garrett said. "Yes." "What does he want?" "The ranch. Legally, he might have a claim to it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "And Miss Thorne?" "She's thinking." Another silence. Garrett looked at the road where the carriage had gone. "How much did you know about this when you came in January?" Caleb turned to look at him. "I knew I wasn't who they'd planned for. I knew I had less to offer, and I told her that on the first night. Everything after that—" He paused. "Everything after that, I earned." Garrett looked at him for a long moment. Not the evaluating look of that first night. Something different, something that had been building for 4 months and had just found its full shape. "Yeah," he said simply. "You did." He turned back toward the barn. "I've got fence work. You coming?" Caleb picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. "Right behind you." But Eliza did not come out of the house for the rest of the afternoon, and when Caleb came in from the fence line in the early evening, the kitchen light was already on. He stood in the yard for a moment, the same cold standing he'd done in February, looking at that lit window, and then went to the bunkhouse instead, because some things needed to be thought through alone first. The crew ate dinner without much conversation. Dunmore cooked and Cole ate slowly because his side still ached in the cold, and nobody said anything about the carriage or the lawyer because in a small crew you understood which silences to fill and which to leave alone. After dinner, Caleb was sharpening a saw blade by the bunkhouse stove, something to do with his hands, when Eliza knocked. She came in, which she almost never did. She looked at the crew briefly, then at Caleb. "Outside," she said. They stood on the bunkhouse step in the cold. The sky was clear, which meant the temperature was already dropping, and Eliza had her coat pulled around her, but she didn't seem to notice the cold the way she never seemed to notice it. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Does he have a legal case?" Caleb thought about it carefully, because she deserved careful. Probably some basis for a claim. The amendment we made was proper, but Hale isn't wrong that the original instrument named Adrian. Whether a court would uphold the amendment or set it aside, he shook his head. I don't know enough property law. You'd need a real attorney. I have a real attorney. He's in Cheyenne, and he'll need a week. She looked at the mountains. What I don't have is time to let this sit. Every day that carriage is parked in cold water, this gets harder. What do you want to do? She turned and looked at him. In the dark, in the cold, with the mountain behind her, and the ranch light coming through the bunkhouse window, her face had the quality it sometimes got, stripped of everything managed and careful, just the actual thing underneath. What I want, she said, and what I can afford to want are two different things. Caleb said nothing. The $12,000, she said, it would clear the debt. It would rebuild the north fence properly. It would get us through another 2 winters without the kind of choices I've been making. She stopped. He's not a bad man. I could see that today. He's capable. He'd probably be useful. He would, Caleb said. It was true, and saying it cost him something, and she could hear both of those things in the 2 words. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he'd been trying to read for 4 months, the one that was always just a step beyond what he could fully parse. Go to sleep, she said finally. We've got fence work before light. She went back to the house. Caleb stood on the step for another moment in the cold, feeling the specific weight of a situation that had no clean answer, the kind that didn't resolve itself overnight, no matter how much thinking you put at it. Inside, Cole's voice came through the bunkhouse wall, asking Dunmore something about the morning chores, and Dunmore answering in his low, even way, and the stove making its familiar sounds. The ordinary machinery of the life he had built in this place, piece by piece, since January. It did not solve anything, but it was real in a way that made the problem feel survivable, which was sometimes the best you could do. He went back inside. He banked the stove, took off his boots, and lay in the dark listening to the mountain wind coming down off the peaks. Tomorrow, Hale would be in Coldwater with his document case. Adrian would be in a warm hotel room, patient and certain, and carrying $12,000 like a hand of cards he knew how to play. The attorney in Cheyenne would need a week. And Eliza Thorne would be awake in her kitchen right now, running the same numbers she'd been running since the day her father died, trying to find the version of them that added up to something she could live with. Caleb stared at the ceiling of the bunkhouse and thought about fence posts, straight in frozen ground, doing the job they were put there to do. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. The attorney from Cheyenne arrived in 6 days, not 7, which was the first thing that had gone faster than expected since January. His name was Beaumont, a small, precise man in his late 50s who wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried 2 document cases instead of 1, and spoke in the measured, unhurried way of someone who had learned that rushing legal language cost more than taking it slow. He sat at Eliza's kitchen table for 3 hours on a Thursday morning and went through every version of the partnership agreement, the amendment, the original family correspondence, and Hale's written claim with the systematic attention of a man disassembling a clock. Caleb was not in the kitchen for that meeting. He was on the north fence line with Garrett, doing the survey work that couldn't wait regardless of what was happening with lawyers, because the cattle didn't care about legal proceedings, and neither did the spring thaw. But he knew the meeting was happening. Everybody on the ranch knew. Cole knew, and he'd barely said a word all morning. Dunmore had made unusually good biscuits for breakfast, which was his way of managing tension he didn't want to talk about. When Caleb came in from the fence line at midday, Beaumont's carriage was still in the yard. He washed up at the pump, which was brutal in the cold but functional now. He'd fixed the freeze problem in February and it had held, and went to the barn to check on the gray mare, who had been favoring her leg again since yesterday. He was there when Eliza found him, 40 minutes later. She came into the barn without her coat, which meant she'd come directly from the house and hadn't planned on staying long. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at him crouched beside the mare's leg, and her expression was the careful one. Everything managed, nothing given away without intention. Beaumont says the claim has merit, she said. Caleb kept his hands on the mare's leg. He'd expected this. How much merit? Enough that a territorial court would likely hear it, possibly enough to win. She came further into the barn, stopped near the center post. The amendment we made, he says it's valid on its face, but the original agreement's language around designated representative creates ambiguity. Hale has been smart about which ambiguities to push. What does Beaumont recommend? Want. He recommends we settle. She said the word like it tasted wrong. He says a negotiated arrangement acknowledging both claims would be cleaner than litigation, less expensive, lower risk. She paused. He says a judge in this territory is more likely to favor established capital and an original named signatory than an amendment made under... She stopped, found the word irregular circumstances. Caleb stood. The mare shifted her weight and he steadied her absently, his hand on her neck. Irregular meaning me. Irregular meaning the situation, Eliza said. He was diplomatic about it. What does the settlement look like? Adrian takes a formal partnership stake, 30%. His capital comes in, which resolves the debt and gives us the north fence rebuild. He has no operational control. That stays with me. But he has financial standing and a share of future proceeds. She looked at the barn floor. Beaumont thinks Hale will accept that. He thinks Adrian will accept that. The barn was quiet except for the mare moving and the sound of wind against the south wall. The same wall with the door he'd fixed in January, which was still holding. Caleb looked at Eliza, and she was not looking at him, and he understood that she was telling him all of this for a reason that wasn't just information, and that the reason was sitting between them unspoken the way things did with her. That leaves me, he said. That leaves you, she said. Beaumont says there's no legal mechanism that preserves your current position if the court recognizes Adrian's claim. Your amendment would be superseded. She finally looked at him. I'm telling you this before it happens, not after. He thought about that for a moment. 4 months and 9 days on this mountain, the fence post, the roof, the hay. Coal's extraction from the pasture and the east wall repair, and 43 fence posts in the freezing dark on his first morning. He thought about the kitchen mornings and the conversations that ran longer than either of them planned, and the light in the window at night, and a woman who had said what I want and what I can afford to want are two different things and had not explained which was which. What do you want to do? He said. I want this ranch to survive, she said immediately. Then, a beat later, quieter. And I want to handle it right. Those might not be the same answer. No, she said. They might not. He nodded slowly. He looked at the mare. The leg's improving, he said. She's putting weight on it more evenly than yesterday. Another week and she should be sound. Eliza looked at him for a moment. Caleb, schedule the hearing for whenever Beaumont thinks is best, he said. I'll be there. She opened her mouth, closed it. She was not a woman who said things twice when once was enough. She turned and walked back to the house, and Caleb stood in the barn and listened to the wind and did not let himself think too far ahead, because there was still fence work this afternoon, and the mare's leg to check again in the morning, and a dozen things that needed doing regardless of what a judge in Coldwater was going to say about them. Adrian came to the ranch 2 days before the hearing. He came alone this time. No Hale, no carriage, riding a hired horse that he handled competently, which Caleb noticed and which he suspected Eliza noticed too. He knocked on the main house door and Eliza let him in, and Caleb, coming in from the paddock, saw through the kitchen window that they were sitting at the table talking. He did not go inside. He went to the bunkhouse, changed his boots, came back out, and started work on a section of paddock fencing that had been on his list all week. He was 3 posts in when he heard boots in the mud behind him, and Adrian said, "You've got a good eye for fence work." Caleb didn't stop working. "What do you need, Adrian?" His brother came and stood beside the fence line, not helping, not leaving. He was in clothes that were closer to practical than his arrival clothes had been. Still better than anything Caleb owned, but an attempt at meeting the ground halfway. I came to talk to you, not about the legal situation. All right? I want to tell you that I didn't come here to take something from you. Caleb tamped the post, checked it, moved to the next position. I know that. Then why does it feel like that's what's happening? Caleb stopped. He turned and looked at his brother. Really looked at him, the way he hadn't let himself do in the yard on that first day. Adrian looked back, and the thing Caleb saw was not the golden brother with the charmed life and the lawyer and the $12,000. It was a man who was genuinely uncertain, standing in Wyoming mud with a hired horse and a situation that had not gone the way he'd imagined, trying to figure out if the damage between them was repairable. You know what the difference is between you and me, Caleb said. Not talent, not intelligence, You're smarter than me in most rooms. The difference is that you have never had to figure out what you are when there's nothing left. When the room is gone, the name is gone, the money is gone. You've never been at zero. He went back to the post. I have. I was at zero in January when I got off that train, and everything I am right now, I built from that. That's the difference. Adrian was quiet for a long time. You think I'd have quit? I think you would have found another option, Caleb said. You're good at finding options. I wasn't at zero because I couldn't find another option. I was at zero because you and Father had used all of them up. Another silence. Adrian looked at the fence, the posts, the paddock. He looked at the ranch with different eyes than he'd had on that first day. Not pricing it now, just seeing it. What do you want out of the hearing? He said finally. I want Eliza to have what she needs. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I've got, Caleb said. The ranch survives. That's what matters. However that happens. Adrian looked at him for another long moment. He nodded once. Not agreement exactly, but understanding, which was its own thing. He walked back to the main house without another word, and Caleb drove the next post into the earth and didn't watch him go. The Coldwater Courthouse was a single-story timber building on the main street, 3 blocks from the station where Caleb had arrived in January in his ruined dress shoes. The courtroom inside was small, 1 judge's bench, 2 tables, a row of benches for observers. The observers on the morning of the hearing were Garrett, Cole, Dunmore, Hobbs, and 3 townspeople who had no direct stake but showed up because territorial legal disputes were the closest thing to theater that Coldwater offered. Judge Harlan Cates was 62, heavy-set, with a white beard and the expression of a man who had been listening to other people's problems for 40 years and was no longer surprised by any of them. He'd read all the relevant documents the night before and asked 3 clarifying questions at the outset, each one precise enough to tell Caleb that this man understood property law better than Hale wanted him to. Hale presented Adrian's case efficiently and without excess. The original agreement's language, the designation of signatory, the irregularity of the amendment, the capital commitment that remained valid and ready. It was a clean argument. Beaumont countered with the amendment's validity, the months of work and value added under the current arrangement, and the hardship that displacing an established working partnership would cause the ranch's operation. The judge listened to both sides without interruption. He looked at the documents. He looked at Caleb, sitting at Beaumont's table, and at Adrian, sitting at Hale's, and at Eliza, who had seated herself apart from both tables, which the judge noticed. Miss Thorne, he said, you are the property owner. The ranch is yours and the partnership arrangement requires your consent to function. I want to hear from you directly. Eliza stood. She stood the way she stood at the ranch, is straight, without performance. Yes, Your Honor. Do you consider the current working arrangement to have been entered into voluntarily and in good faith? I do. And the capital deficit that Mr. Mercer's original commitment was intended to address, is that deficit currently a threat to the ranch's viability? A pause. It's manageable. It's not resolved. The judge made a note. He looked at his papers. In my reading of the original agreement and the subsequent amendment, I find that both instruments carry legal weight and that neither entirely supersedes the other under existing territorial statute. He set his pen down. My inclination is toward a shared arrangement, a formal partnership acknowledging both the original signatory's capital claim and the working partner's established contribution. 30% to Adrian Mercer, reflecting his capital investment. The operational structure remains with Miss Thorne. He looked at the room. I would ask the parties to, No. The word came from Eliza. Quiet, absolute, the way a door being closed is absolute. The judge looked at her. Miss Thorne. I said no. She reached into her coat and put a document on the table in front of her. That is a notice of contract termination. Both contracts, the original and the amendment. She looked at the judge steadily. I am voiding both instruments under the property owner's right to rescind a partnership agreement within the first year, which is established in Territorial Code Section 41. Beaumont found it for me last night. Hale was on his feet. Your Honor, the capital commitment creates a separate... The capital was never transferred, Eliza said. She didn't look at Hale. She looked at the judge. It was committed in the original agreement, but transfer was contingent on the partnership being established and operational. It was never established as written. Therefore, no capital obligation exists. She paused. I have spoken with my banker in Cheyenne. I have arranged an alternative line of credit that addresses the ranch's debt. It costs more in interest than Adrian Mercer's money would have. I have accepted that cost. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Cates looked at the termination notice. He looked at Beaumont, who had the expression of a man who had found Section 41 last night and had spent several hours deciding whether to mention it, and had apparently decided to let his client make her own choices. He looked at Hale, who was doing rapid calculations behind his eyes. He looked at Adrian, who was sitting very still. Both instruments, the judge said. Both instruments, Eliza confirmed. The judge read the termination notice. He read it again. He looked at the relevant section of the territorial code that Beaumont had helpfully bookmarked. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The termination appears to be within the owner's legal right, he said finally. Mr. Hale, the capital commitment claim becomes moot if the partnership agreement under which it was made is validly rescinded. He looked at Hale over his glasses. You may explore whether other grounds exist, but I won't find them here today. Hale sat down slowly. The judge set the papers flat on his bench and looked out at the room. This matter is... He paused, and something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but the close relative of it. This matter is resolved by the property owner's action. Case dismissed. He picked up his gavel. I hope everyone has a pleasant trip home. The gavel came down. In the 3 seconds that followed, before the room found its voice, Caleb looked at Eliza. She was still standing at her table, her hand flat on the termination notice, not looking at anyone. Then she looked at him, and her face did the thing it sometimes did. Stripped down to the actual thing, the one underneath the managed version. And what he saw there was not triumph. It was the face of a woman who had just set fire to the safe path and was watching it burn and was absolutely certain she'd done right. Then Adrian said, Eliza. And she turned, and Caleb watched his brother stand and cross the room and offer his hand to her. That was the bravest financial decision I have ever witnessed, Adrian said. I mean that. She shook his hand. I'm sorry it came to this. Don't be, Adrian said. He glanced at Caleb, and in that glance was everything the two brothers hadn't said to each other in the yard at the ranch, and maybe hadn't said to each other in the previous 30 years. Complicated, honest, unresolved in the way of family things that don't resolve cleanly. Then he put his hat on and walked out with Hale behind him, and the courtroom began to breathe again. Garrett had been sitting in the third bench from the front. He stood now and looked at Caleb with that straight, unembellished look he'd had since the barn door, since the hay, since the morning he'd put Caleb's name alone on the assignment board. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something specific between people who had worked together through a hard winter. Beaumont was gathering his papers. Eliza came around the table and stood in the center of the courtroom, and the space cleared around her the way spaces did, and she looked at Caleb. Walk with me, she said. They walked out of the courthouse and down the main street of Coldwater, past the station where the train came in, past the supply store where Caleb had not yet bought new dress shoes because he no longer needed them. The town was doing its ordinary Tuesday business around them, and neither of them paid it much attention. You took on a worse loan, Caleb said. Yes. Higher interest rate. Yes. That's going to cost you 3-4 years of tighter margins. I know the numbers, Caleb. He looked at her. Why? She stopped walking. They were at the edge of town where the road began to climb back toward the mountain, and the snow was still on the high peaks above them, and the air had the particular quality of Wyoming spring, cold and clear and carrying the smell of pine and running water. She looked up at the peaks for a moment, then at him. Because the alternative was wrong, she said. The judge's solution was legally sound and practically reasonable and completely wrong, and I have spent enough of my life doing things that were practically reasonable and completely wrong. She paused. My father died owing money to 4 people because he kept making practically reasonable decisions in a situation that needed something else. She looked at Caleb directly. I voided both contracts, which means I have no legal obligation to you either. He felt the ground shift slightly under that sentence. I know. So I am asking you, she said, and her voice was even and careful, and he could hear the effort it cost her. Not offering you an obligation, not extending a contract, asking you, as a person who has spent 4 months watching you become someone I didn't expect, whether you want to stay. The wind came down off the mountain and moved between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Not as a ranch hand, she said, not as a representative of anybody, as a partner, equal terms. The ranch carries both our names, or it doesn't carry yours at all. She held his gaze. I can't promise it works. I can't promise the debt doesn't swallow us. I can't promise the mountain gives us anything back that it hasn't already taken. I know, Caleb said. Then what do you say? He looked at the mountain. He looked at Coldwater Station, where he had arrived in January in dress shoes with $400 and nowhere else to go. He looked at Eliza Thorne, who had fixed his blister with the same expression she used on a horse's leg, who had talked about plant biology at midnight, who had just walked into a territorial courthouse and set fire to the safe path without blinking. Yes, he said, I'll stay. She nodded once. Not a relief. Something more careful than relief. Something that was aware of what it was agreeing to and had decided to agree anyway. She turned and started up the road toward where the horses were tied, and after a moment Caleb fell into step beside her. Behind them, Coldwater went on doing its ordinary business. Above them, the mountain waited with its usual patience, enormous and cold and completely indifferent, the way it had always been. But Caleb was done being indifferent back. The ride back up the mountain was quiet in the way that things are quiet after something large has happened, and neither person is ready to talk about it yet. Eliza rode ahead where the trail narrowed, and Caleb rode behind, and the pines closed in on both sides, and the snow on the high peaks caught the afternoon light, and the horses moved steadily upward without being pushed. There was nothing romantic about it. His horse was the same difficult roan that had unseated him twice in February and still had opinions about pace. His back ached from the courthouse bench. The practical reality of what Eliza had done, what they had both agreed to, was already assembling itself in his mind in the form of interest rates and debt schedules, and the specific amount of work that a tighter margin over 3 or 4 years actually meant. He did not find this discouraging. That surprised him a little. When they rode into the yard, Garrett was at the fence line, and Cole was with the cattle, and Dunmore was doing something to the east storage roof that required a ladder and considerable muttering. The ranch was doing what it always did, demanding, immediate, indifferent to anything that had happened in a courthouse 40 minutes down the mountain. Caleb unsaddled his horse, rubbed him down, turned him into the paddock, and went to help Dunmore with the roof before anyone had asked him to. How'd it go? Dunmore said, not looking down from the ladder. Eliza voided both contracts. A pause. Both. Both. Another pause. So what are you now? Partner, Caleb said. He handed up the tool Dunmore was reaching for. Equal stake. Dunmore climbed down the ladder. He looked at Caleb with that measuring quiet he'd had since the first week, since the bunkhouse conversation about the counting house. Huh, he said. Then he climbed back up the ladder and went back to the roof. But as he worked, his shoulders had a different quality to them. Something settled, something that said, all right then, that's how it is. That evening, Eliza called everyone into the main house kitchen, which had never happened before. Garrett and Cole and Dunmore and Hobbs stood around the edges of the room, while Eliza stood at the stove and told them plainly what had happened in Coldwater, the voided contracts, the new bank arrangement, the partnership as it now stood. She did not dress it up. She told them about the tighter margins and what that would mean for wages in the short term, not reduced but not increased either, and no room for error. She told them the ranch was carrying more debt than she'd like and less cushion than she'd prefer, and that the next 2 to 3 years were going to require everyone on that mountain to work as well as they knew how. Then she said, I'm not asking anyone to stay who doesn't want to. That's a fair choice, and I'll honor it. Nobody moved. Cole looked at the floor, and then at Caleb, and then at Eliza. I'm not going anywhere, he said, which was the most words he'd strung together in a meeting in the entire time Caleb had known him. Garrett said nothing. He just put his hat back on, which meant he was ready to get back to work, which meant he was staying. Dunmore said, I'll need to know about the hay budget. I'll have numbers for you by Friday, Eliza said. Then we're fine, Dunmore said. Hobbs, who had said 4 words to Caleb in January and had graduated to perhaps 12 since then, looked at Caleb from across the room with an expression that was as close to approval as Hobbs appeared to get. He nodded once and walked out, which in Hobbs' language was a speech. What followed was not a transformation. That word implies something cleaner than what actually happened. A before and an after, with a clear line between them. What actually happened was more like what happens when a river changes course. The water finds the new channel slowly, and for a long time you can still see the marks of the old one, and the ground takes time to settle, and there are places where it floods, and places where it runs dry before it evens out. The debt was real, and it demanded real things. Eliza renegotiated 2 of the supply contracts herself, driving down to Coldwater in early May with a ledger and a willingness to walk away that she hadn't had when she was working alone, because now there was someone to go over the numbers with her beforehand. Someone who had done nothing but work with numbers for 4 years and who could spot the places where a contract was generous to the wrong party. The supply company they renegotiated with got less favorable terms than they'd been getting. The company accepted them because Eliza Thorne's ranch was regular business, and regular business was worth keeping. "You're good at that," Caleb told her on the way back. "At what?" "Walking away. Knowing when to walk away." She thought about it. "My father couldn't do it. He always thought the relationship was more important than the terms." She kept her eyes on the road. "Sometimes it is. Most of the time it isn't." "When is it?" She glanced at him sideways. "When you can't replace what you'd lose." He looked at the road. He let that sit where she'd put it. The north fence rebuild started in late May, once the ground had softened enough to set posts properly. It was the biggest single project the ranch had undertaken since before Eliza's father died, and it required all of them. Garrett's knowledge of the grade and the cattle's movement patterns, Caleb's survey work from spring, Cole's speed once he was fully recovered, Dunmore's steady, relentless capacity to simply keep going. They worked in sections, starting at the highest point and moving down, and there were days when the weather came in sideways and they worked in it anyway, because the posts were already in the ground and the wire needed to be run before the rain softened the footings. It was during the fence rebuild that Caleb and Garrett had the only real conversation they'd ever had about the beginning. They were on the 3rd section, late in the afternoon, Garrett holding wire while Caleb drove the staples, and Garrett said, without preamble, "I was hard on you in January." Caleb drove a staple. "You were fair. I gave you 4 days. You didn't know me. Still." Garrett looked at the fence line stretching back down the slope. "My wife says I judge too fast. She's usually right." Caleb looked at him. Garrett having a wife was information he had not possessed until this moment. "I didn't know you were married." 23 years. She's in Laramie with her sister this month." He picked up the next section of wire. "Point is, you proved the assessment wrong. That matters." "To who?" Garrett looked at him straight. "To me," he said, simply and without elaboration, and went back to the wire. That was the entirety of it, but Caleb carried it the way he carried other small things that turned out to have weight, carefully, in a place where it wouldn't get lost. The first summer as equal partners was the hardest summer Caleb had ever worked, and the best one he could remember. The distinction between those two things was something he'd understood intellectually before the mountain but had never actually felt. Now he felt it most mornings when he was tired in the right way, and the work ahead was real, and the result of it would belong, in some material and legal and earned sense, to him. Not to a family name, not to someone else's door with someone else's title on it. To him, and to the woman riding beside him, and to the land they were both responsible for. He and Eliza were not smooth about it. That was the human part, the part that the early kitchen mornings and the barn conversations hadn't prepared either of them for, because those had been two people being careful with each other across a distance. And now the distance had changed, and careful was harder to calibrate. She was used to running the ranch alone and making decisions alone, and she caught herself doing it sometimes, coming to a conclusion and starting to act on it before she'd said anything to him. And he would find out after, and there would be a conversation that was uncomfortable for both of them. He was not always right in those conversations. She was not always right either. They figured it out the way people figure out most real things, which is to say imperfectly and incrementally and with occasional backsliding. One evening in July, after one of those conversations that had gone longer and harder than either of them had planned, Eliza was sitting on the porch steps, and Caleb came out and sat beside her, not too close, and they looked at the last light on the peaks for a while without talking. I don't know how to do this part, she said finally. It cost her something to say it. He could hear that. Neither do I, he said. I'm figuring it out at the same rate you are. That's not reassuring. No, he said, but it's honest. She looked at him. Something in her face loosened slightly, the managed version giving way to the actual one. My mother left when I was 9, she said. She said this mountain was no place to spend a life. She wasn't wrong exactly, but she was wrong about what that meant. She looked back at the peaks. I've spent 20 years making sure I didn't need anyone enough that them leaving would break something. He said nothing. He knew the value of being quiet in the right moment. It's a hard habit to break, she said. I know, he said. I spent 4 years being invisible on purpose because being noticed meant being measured against Adrian and losing. He paused. Turns out invisibility is its own kind of prison. She looked at him, then she put her hand over his on the step between them. Not dramatically, just set it there, deliberate and quiet. He turned his hand over. They sat like that until the light was gone from the peaks, and the first cold came down off the mountain and the ranch was making its night sounds around them. Then she went inside and he went to the bunkhouse, and nothing had been resolved and everything had shifted. And that was exactly the right pace for two people who had both learned the hard way what it cost to move faster than the ground was ready for. Cole left in the second autumn. He left well, gave 2 weeks' notice, helped train the new man Garrett had found in Coldwater, shook everyone's hand. He'd been offered work on a larger operation closer to Laramie, steadier wages, less remote. It was the right move for him, and they all knew it. His leaving was also the moment Caleb understood that the crew was not permanent, that the family he'd started to feel on this mountain was not fixed, but was a thing that required tending the same way the fence did. You maintained it, or it failed. The new man's name was Prescott, younger than Cole, quieter, with a competence that was different in shape but solid. He watched Caleb in his first 2 weeks the way everyone watched the person whose position they were trying to understand, and what he saw. A man who fixed things, who knew the fence survey, who went over numbers with the boss and drove posts and made decisions and showed up before light, settled into a clear picture fast. Prescott didn't have to be told twice, and he didn't complain about the cold. Garrett approved of him, which was the relevant measure. The debt was ahead of schedule by 18 months. Caleb figured this out on a Tuesday in October of the second year, going over the accounts at the kitchen table, and the realization was quiet enough that he sat with it for a minute before he said anything. Eliza was across the table with her own ledger. He slid the relevant page across to her. She looked at it. She looked at his arithmetic, because she always checked his arithmetic, which was fair. That's right, she said. I've checked it 3 times. She looked at the page for another moment. She set it down. She said, huh, which was not a celebration, but which contained one, in the compressed and practical way of people who don't celebrate things until they're sure. We should be careful about the spring hay cost, he said. That could change the picture if the price moves. I know, but the cattle numbers are up. They are. She looked at him across the table, and there was something in her face that was almost like relief, but steadier. The look of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for a long time and had just felt it shift into a different balance. Not gone, but different. Your father's attorney sent another letter, she said. I know. I wrote back. What did you say? That the ranch is in good standing and that no further family involvement is sought or welcome. He paused. Politely. The corner of her mouth moved. Politely. Mostly. She looked back at the ledger, but the corner of her mouth stayed where it was. Adrian wrote twice in those 2 years. Real letters, not legal correspondence. Handwritten, which was itself a statement about intent. The first was from Denver, where he'd gone into a land investment partnership with 2 other men and was doing well at it. He asked how the ranch was going without quite asking how Caleb was going, which was Adrian's way of asking both. The second letter was from San Francisco, and it included a photograph of a woman he described as someone I've been seeing for a year and intend to keep seeing. He asked Caleb to write back. Caleb did. It was not a long letter, and it was not a complete resolution of everything between them, because those don't exist in real families. But it was a beginning. The beginning of something different. Not brothers who had grown up in the same house under the same pressures, but 2 men who had arrived at separate lives through the same difficult passage and were deciding whether to stay in contact. Caleb thought that was worth something. Not everything, but something. In the third spring, Eliza's mare had a foal, the same gray mare whose leg Caleb had been watching since January of his first winter, who had come sound in February and had been sound since. The foal came at night, in the barn, and Caleb and Eliza were both there because the mare had been close for days, and neither of them had wanted to leave her. The birth was difficult enough that they were both on their feet for most of it, and then suddenly, in the strange and exhausted way of those moments, there was a foal, wet and angular, and improbably alive. And the mare was attending to her with the focused, absolute attention of a mother who had just decided what the rest of her life was for. Eliza was crouched in the straw. Caleb was beside her. They were both tired in the specific way of people who have been awake all night watching something important, and neither of them said anything for a while. "She's going to be good," Eliza said finally, about the foal. "She's going to be difficult," Caleb said. "Look at the way she's already trying to stand." "That's not difficulty. That's will." He looked at the foal, struggling upright, failing, trying again with the stubborn, unselfconscious persistence of something that doesn't yet know failure is an option. He thought, yes, exactly that. "What are you going to name her?" he said. Eliza considered. In the dim barn light, with straw in her hair and her coat muddy at the knees, she looked at the foal and she looked at Caleb, and she looked at the barn around them. The south door that was still holding, the east wall support, the hay stacked solid in the upper level. And he thought she might be looking at all of it at once, the way you sometimes look at a thing that you've been building for so long, you forgot to stop and see it. "Mercer," she said. He looked at her. "The foal," she said evenly. "I'll name her Mercer." He looked back at the foal, who had found her legs at last and was standing in the straw with the trembling, improbable determination of something new. He said nothing. He did not need to. Years later, when people asked Caleb how he had ended up running a ranch in Wyoming when he'd grown up in a Boston counting house, he would answer differently depending on who was asking and how much time he had. The short answer was that he'd been sent there and stayed. The longer answer involved a train in winter, a woman who fixed blisters with the same expression she gave injured horses, a mountain that had no interest in who you used to be, and the specific education of being stripped down to zero and discovering that zero was a beginning rather than an ending. The truest answer, the one he only said out loud once to Eliza, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch steps watching their daughter try to convince Prescott to let her ride the difficult roan, was this: "I thought being sent here was the end of something. I thought my family had run out of ways to include me, so they'd found a way to get rid of me that looked like consideration." He paused. "They had. But the place they sent me to didn't know that. And the person who met me at the station didn't know that. And after a while, I stopped knowing it too." Eliza said, "You were never what they thought you were." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it in January." "That's what January is for," she said, which was the most she'd ever distilled about any of it, and she said it the way she said everything that mattered, quiet, direct, without looking for a response. On the mountain, their daughter was arguing her case to Prescott with the focused persistence of someone who did not accept no as a final position, and Prescott was holding firm with the expression of a man who respected the attempt while absolutely not moving. The roan watched them both from behind the fence with his usual professional skepticism. The peaks were catching the last of the afternoon light. The ranch was making its ordinary sounds. The cattle, the wind, the particular creak of the barn roof that Caleb kept meaning to fix and kept finding other things to do first. He would fix it next week, or the week after. The mountain would wait. It always did. Thorne Mercer Ranch. That was what the sign said now at the bottom of the road where it met the Coldwater track. Both names, because she had insisted on both and he had not argued. He had argued about the order. Mercer Thorne had a better sound, he'd said, and she had looked at him with the expression that still, after all these years, told him he had approximately a 10% chance of winning this argument, and he had accepted the arrangement. He accepted a lot of things on those terms, and considered it fair. The man who had stepped off that train in January in dress shoes with $400 and a document in his pocket, and a family that had run out of uses for him. That man would not have recognized this. Would not have recognized the hands, the posture, the ease with which he moved through the barn, the way he read the weather off the peaks in the morning and knew what it meant for the day. Would not have recognized the woman beside him or the fact of her being beside him, or the life they had built together out of debt and bad timing, and two people who had both, independently and for different reasons, run out of road at the same moment. He would not have recognized any of it, but he would have stayed anyway. He had nowhere else to go, and the mountain, whatever it cost, had always been willing to take the people nobody else wanted, the ones who arrived wrong, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons, and find out what they were actually made of. It turned out Caleb Mercer was made of more than anyone had bothered to check. The mountain had known that before he did. It had simply waited, the way it always waited, for him to figure it out.